Welcome to the Go Rhody podcast. I'm your host, Scott Brand. Tonight, we're going to be talking about salary caps. We're offering a beginner's guide to salary caps. You can't be an NBA fan if you don't understand salary caps. If you think an apron is something you wear when you're cooking, then you better stick around because I've got a great guest tonight, Mr. Eric Pincus. How are you, Eric?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Eric is not only a national writer for the Bleacher Report, but he's a capologist. That means he's a doctor of salary caps.
It's a contract. It's a really that's all it is it's a
Yeah.
long contract, but it's an agreement between the players represented by the NBPA and the teams and the league represented by the NBA, and that's why we have the game as we have it because of this set of rules that governs how the NBA operates. These little mechanisms to trigger a first apron. So just for perspective, it's like a ladder.
Yeah.
And so you start at the ladder where a team has to get to the minimum, which is 90% of the cap. The cap itself is at 100, let's call it 141. You have to
Okay.
get to about 126 before the start of the season. Okay. That's the minimum. So the teams that don't spend much, the rebuilding teams, they need to get to that line. Detroit gave Tobias Harris a really nice contract because they needed to get up to that number. So
Oh,
that's one of those aspects of like, uh, the new CBA is terrible. Well, Tobias Harris just got paid more than market based on a team needing, just like Bruce Brown got more than market last year, just with the Pacers, which helped them get Siakam from Toronto in trade, and that was a function of the new CBA. So then you keep going up higher, and we have so 126 roughly is this minimum team salary. 141 is the luxury tax. You go higher. Sorry, the salary cap. You go higher to the luxury tax is about 171. So again, these are estimates, but that's about 30 million higher than the cap is the tax. And some teams will avoid tax. Period. They've never paid it, never will. I don't want to say never because never's a long time, but under current ownership, teams like the Hawks avoid it. Teams like the Pelicans, the Grizzlies, generally speaking, avoid. There's a lot of I can go. There's a lot of teams that just don't pay the tax, and all that is a financial penalty. It used to be more. It used to limit you somehow. Doesn't limit you anymore. It's just money. The team has to pay, and if they're losing money, the owner has to come out of his pocket to pay or her pocket to pay uh, the the penalty, which is just money. Which money matters, but it doesn't limit the team. But now, as you get higher, that first apron is about 178. So we said 171 for the tax. About
hmm.
seven above is that first apron.
Hmm.
And generally speaking, teams try to stay under the first apron for the flexibility, but it's not punitive to go higher. Obviously, the higher you spend, the more tax you pay. It's a progressive tax. Every 5 million, it gets more and more and more expensive, but it's not outrageous at those first apron or above levels. So you have a mid-level exception, which is right now it's 13 million roughly
I
that you
always
can.
hear that mid-level tax exemption. Why do we
Well,
need the word
it's
tax
not.
in here? Is that
It's the
correct
mid.
or
It's
someone's
the
just
mid-level. So there's the mid-level exception itself. That's
okay?
the overarching thing. So there's the mid-level exception, MLE. It
Yeah.
exists in flavors. So you have one item. It's like ordering ice cream, different flavors. So every team gets a mid-level going into the season. The question is where are you in relation to the cap? If you're below the cap, you get the room mid-level, which is about 8 million. If you're above the cap, you get the non-taxpayer, which is about 13 million. But as you get to that apron, if you get over it, you don't have 13, you get the taxpayer payer version. That's the flavor you get, which is about 5 million roughly. So you have less to spend.
Hmm.
And if you go over, so then we have that second apron, which is about 189. So we said 178 for the first apron, which is
Hmm.
about seven above the tax. 178 for that apron. We go up another 10 or 11 and we get to the second apron. So there's a little room that you have to operate under. That's where the Lakers are, for instance. Like they've internally set the second apron as their own internal limit on what they want to spend. They don't want to go above that line. So while they don't have a hard cap at that, they've sort of internally chosen to have a hard cap. Now, if you do certain things, you could have an official one. They haven't done that. And then you have the teams that are above that second apron. For instance, Boston. They
Have you
paid
done
all their
that?
guys to stay.
Hmm.
They don't have any of
Fascinating.
these. They don't have access to their mid-level exception because their payroll is so high. All they can do is sign guys for the minimum, but they can always pay they have the rights to pay their own players, which is very important for the NBPA, the players, to have rights matter. The longer you're with a team, the more a team can pay you. If you're with a team for 1 year, you can get a little bump. You're with a team for 2 years, you can get a decent bump. And you can also, if you're like a low paid guy, you can at least get the average of what everyone else is getting, roughly. And then if you've been with a team for 3 years or more, you can get the max. And that max might be anywhere from 35 to $50 million, almost, roughly, rough numbers this year. Depends on how many years you've been in the league and some incentives based on performance, like Jaylen Brown or Jason Tatum or Luka Doncic. Sometimes you can jump up a little early. So that there's a lot of numbers I've thrown at you, but the
Hmm.
basic concept of this ladder is that the higher up you go, the more we take away your tools and limit your tools so that as you get to be the Warriors and you get to the Clippers, we're going to stop you from just spend, 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 spend. And those teams pivoted and they have chosen to go a different direction because of these punishments. The system appears to be working based
Hmm.
on the actions of the Clippers and the Warriors to avoid this. System is designed to reduce the flexibility and the tools you have. So if you're, the more you spend. So if you're below the first apron, then you're fine. Um, if you're above the first apron, you have some limitations, and that can be, if you trigger a first apron hard cap by doing what we said with the Knicks in that initial report, they wouldn't have been able to go over 179 million or 178 million. So what they did is they changed it a little bit. They made a few other moves, and that gave them a second apron hard cap. So now they can't go over one, we'll call it 189, right? So by using strategy and negotiation and intelligence, uh, and that's obviously a subjective thing. They were able to manipulate the system legally to give themselves the most flexibility to build the team that they wanted to build. For those bemoaning like my team can't do anything, and they don't, well, they can. They haven't made the strategic moves to do something, or they're saving their opportunity for another time. I know Laker fans they're like, Lakers haven't made any moves other than drafting two kids. Literally a kid, LeBron's kid, who may or may not matter as a player this year in terms of the team's winning. It's a lot to ask of any 55th pick. And then they got a kid, Dalton Connect, who was a nice surprise for them at 17. A guy they had top 10, top five, wherever they had him, they got a 17. So they're very happy about that. But they haven't made any other moves because of a lot of reasons. And one of them is they don't have roster space and this limit of spending that they've assigned to themselves. And even if they were willing to spend more, they really only have the minimum, but then they don't have roster space. So like they could have added Gary Trent or Tyus Jones at the minimum and just cut somebody else and gone over
Yeah.
that second apron. That was their choice. They didn't. Though I don't bemoan, like, if a team makes a choice, they make a choice. And the rules force you into making difficult choices. That's not a bad thing. It shouldn't be easy to build a team. It shouldn't be easy to make trades. It should be hard to do this.
Hmm.
Otherwise everyone would do it and everybody would win every year, but only one team wins. So it should be difficult. And I'm not criticizing anyone individually. There may be, like Lakers may be saving their bullets for or saving their ammunition for a trade at the deadline, or maybe they think just changing the coach is enough reason why they will be a better team this year. So again, just like all these, is the CBA good or bad? Is the apron? These are not the results answer the question. We're looking at we're in July, end of July, start of August. There's no, everyone's at 0-0 right now. There's no worst team. There's no best team. Boston on paper is the best team because they just won, but they have the same record as the Charlotte Hornets right now. So there is no right or wrong. We just have to, we can look at it with our own eyes and say this isn't going to work. And usually, sometimes, yeah, I think a lot of people are right when you look ahead and say this isn't going to work. It was pretty easy to see the Detroit Pistons weren't going to work, and they didn't work. But sometimes you look at a team and say, I didn't know that Indiana was going to be this good. I didn't know that Orlando was going to be that good this last year. Dallas was either going to be a catastrophe or mediocre, and then they got to the conference finals. So, or actually the NBA finals. So,
It was a
uh,
surprise.
it's easy to point, and cast aspersions now.
Yeah.
And there are people who are paid to do so, and including myself. But I try to be a little more objective and try to at least allow for my knowledge is of what's going to happen is limited, like any other person. We can project, but we don't really know.
The thing that I still don't understand is what is the benefit of a mid-level exemption? Everyone wants to get that, have that one available to them. When it, you can't go past 189 without the most stringent
Well,
violation.
sure.
So how do they
It's
fit together? Does that
so
make
yeah, for sure. It's actually the exception. Exemption is something else, but exception is so.
it's
These are
called
exceptions.
level exception, not
Correct.
exemption. Here we
Right.
go.
Correct.
That's why I'm doing this today.
That's fair enough.
Made a
It's
mistake,
little.
but someone's
Um.
gonna learn from it, right?
So if you want to sign a player that was on another team, you need the means to pay that player. Now
Mhm.
the means could be cap room, but if there were only 6 or 7 teams with cap room this summer, and they like Detroit went out and paid Tobias Harris a ton of money. I'm happy for Tobias, but they didn't need the mid level exception. They didn't have their non-taxpayer mid-level exception because they were a team that was under the cap. So they didn't have that 12, 13 million because they had cap room, which was in their case like 20 something. So they were able to exceed that line, that exception. They had more than the exception in cap room. So for the teams that are under the cap, it's not relevant. That's all. I'm 6, 7 teams wasn't relevant.
Yeah.
Then you have the teams that don't have. How else would you sign a player? For instance, how it's
Hmm.
if you want to go get another team's player, but you don't have the money because you don't have the rights to them. It's another team's player. How do you get that player? You need to have a tool, and the tools are maybe the minimum, which ranges from 1 to 3 something million, but that's not 15 or 12 or 13 million, right? Uh, if you want to pay, for instance, 5 or 6 million, 8 million, there are different tools that
Hmm.
teams have. But if you want to get another team's player, you have to have the means for it. So if we go over to, for instance, Chicago, they paid about 9 million, 8.5 for Jalen Smith from Indiana. They didn't have his rights. They needed to use some of their mid-level exception to pay what the market would pay, what the market would bear. The Warriors used their exception, their mid-level exception, the whole thing on DeAnthony Melton because they decided paying him 13 was better than paying Clay about 20. So the point is that if you want to bring in a talent that is going to cost a certain price, you have to use one of these larger exceptions. In this case, the mid-level exception, the non-taxpayer one. But if you do so, you are agreeing to have a spending limit, and that's just not going to matter for a lot of teams. You just have to manage your books and make sure that you don't. If the Clippers agreed to not pay more than 178.1, the league won't approve of any transaction that would possibly put them over that line. So for them, it's just a decision. Fine, we're not going to pay Paul George in the neighborhood of $50 million, and instead we'll pay Derek Jones just about 10. And so, just looking at their numbers, you're paying Kawhi about 49, James Harden about 34, Norm Powell 19, and Zubats Tucker, man in the 11 range, Derek Jones Jr., the new addition, about 9.5. Everybody else is below 10. And if you total up all their payroll, they're at about 175. Yeah, 170, 173. I have to double check my numbers. They're 175. Depends on Kai Jones. If they keep Kai Jones, who is on a non-guaranteed contract. So if they keep Kai Jones, they're at about 175. Well, that limit that they triggered, this first apron, by doing Derek Jones is at 178. So if they stop at 175, they have a roster of 15 players. What is the issue here? And so yeah, as I look at it, they can't keep Kai Jones as situated because they already have 15 guaranteed players. So let's assume they cut Kai Jones. He's just there for they could make a trade or do something
Hmm.
else. But let's say that they just cut him, and they don't owe him any money. They cut him before the season. They're at about 174, and that apron is at 178. So the answer to why you would use a mid-level exception, a non-taxpayer to trigger a hard cap is because you want to add a player who is good, who you think will help you. You just have to manage your money so that you stay below a certain line and make difficult decisions. In this case, for the Clippers, the difficult decision was not re-signing Paul George. And for reference, is that because of the new rules, or is it because he signed for 4 years and what's his total? $212 million with the Sixers. And yeah, the Clippers could have paid him a little more than that, but let's say they signed the same deal. Well, he was born in 1990, so he's already 34. So, and the team has seen limited success. So those rights, they're nicknamed Larry Bird. It's not actually in the rules, Larry Bird. It's just sort of a name that we use. But that is the non-bird, the early bird, the full bird. That's where if you're with a team for 1 year, you can re-sign for a little bump. 2 years, you can sign for a medium-sized bump, or at least the average. And then if you have full bird or Larry Bird, that's where you can re-sign for up to the max. And so preserving that ability, that still exists, and that's how the Warriors got to where they got to, and that's why they could have stayed. They could have used the Larry Bird rights for Klay Thompson to keep him. The Clippers could have used Larry Bird rights on Paul George to keep him. They made the choice not to, and that's all the NBPA is asking for, is that those rights exist. And if a team wants to pay, and this is what the Celtics did, Celtics said, we want to keep the group together. We want to use the rights that we have, in this case, the Larry Bird rights, to pay Jaylen Brown last year, to pay Jason Tatum this year, to pay Drew Holiday, to pay Porzingis a little bit when they traded for him. They gave him a little extension. To pay Derek White, to pay Peyton Pritchard last year. They just extended, who's the other kid? Hauser, right? They just gave
That's right.
Sam Hauser an extension, right? So those are examples of a team using those rights that the NBPA fights for and protects. And the Celtics are looking at significant taxes. They can only add minimums. Trades will be difficult. At least any trade that adds money is difficult. But other than that, it's a choice. And again, there's choice in these new rules.
Well, this was
That
great.
too,
I'm
yes.
so glad we did this, and I'm going to digest all this information, but I think we're all going to have a lot more educated NBA fans. And you can't watch a podcast without the information that you gave us today. I'm just telling you, it's a
Thank
fact.
you.
And I feel like I'm in the club now, and our fans,
Of
viewers are in the club. So once again, thanks so much for coming in.
course. Happy to
And
do it. Thanks for having me.
we'll be watching you. I'll be following you on Twitter, and can't wait to see what you're writing about next.
Yes, sir. Me too.
Publication.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks again, Eric, and good luck to you in your future endeavors.